Hello and welcome to session 274 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the post Conjecture Internal Infohazard Policy by Connor Leahy and others. Conjecture is a relatively new AI alignment organization led by Connor Leahy, and the other authors are Sid Black, Chris Scammell, and Andrea Miotti. This is a post on Less Wrong, which is just under a year old by now. So let's first talk about what is an infohazard. The term infohazard was defined by Nick Bostrom in his 2011 paper, A Typology of Information Hazards, in which he defines an infohazard as a risk that arises from the dissemination of true information that may cause harm or enable some agent to cause harm. And because this is Nick Bostrom, then he obviously has like this huge typology with 33 distinct types. But in this article we are considering a much smaller subset, only the risks that come from accelerated AGI timelines. And this is both only like one kind of infohazard, and it's also restricted to one specific domain. So like if it's information that accelerates, I don't know, bioweapon timelines or something like that, then that's not really relevant to this. And I think this raises the obvious question: what if an infohazard is uncovered that doesn't fit into this? Like it may be someone at Conjecture finds a prompt that is really good for like creating continuations that end up with like bioweapons or something like that, or worse, there maybe is a new basilisk discovered or something like that. In that case, we would probably want to do the opposite of what this is. In particular, we would not want to tell Connor if we discover a new basilisk. So this specific kind of infohazard is one that other people are obviously interested in about. And 2 weeks before this post was published to Less Wrong, Eliezer Yudkowsky had a kind of similar post about infohazards where he asked for a name for this, like a socio-hazard, and the one that he believed was best was an exfohazard. I must admit I haven't seen other people use exfohazard except here, so the name hasn't really caught on, and we'll just continue referring to it as infohazards. And one of the things that I think probably are also covered by this infohazard is like how does Conjecture deal with confidential information, like for instance pivotal acts, if they get information about those. Let's start by talking about the goals of writing this document. Conjecture lists those goals, but I would like to, before that, compare the default situation where Conjecture doesn't write that post. Because that has in fact some advantages. Like there's a Streisand effect where writing that you have that you potentially have very dangerous information is something that draws attention to yourself, and it is a possibility that just normal business confidentiality, like all other businesses have, would have been sufficient. This is of course my thoughts, so it's not something that Conjecture talks about explicitly here. So one of the goals is to encourage accountability among the people who may spread information. And one limiting case that I've considered in detail is Chris Leong, who on Petrov Day in 2020 entered the code and took down Less Wrong, mostly because he didn't take it seriously. And he was maybe also cheated, but he also didn't take it very seriously. And this kind of thing is the kind of thing that could happen with dangerous information. And the question is like, how accountable should we hold him? I think people have mostly forgiven Chris Leong, and I'm actually unsure whether that is actually correct. A second goal of publishing this is promoting cross-organization collaboration. I found two people Tammy, who has something like log posts that reference this, and the new organization called Orthogonal that doesn't implement this policy but just say this is reasonable. And apart from that, I haven't seen any other organizations that have like made any kind of clear reference to this. That doesn't mean that there is nothing there, right? There could certainly be a number of people who have collaborated more with Conjecture because they know they have this policy, and perhaps also people taking up this kind of policy without making it explicit, but nothing has been written as far as I can say. And finally, the goal has been to start a conversation about Infohazard policies. This is something we've seen previously work out in rare cases. For instance, there was a push towards having a policy on publishing your AI alignment strategy for the AI organizations, and that did in fact turn out to, in the end, cause Anthropic and DeepMind to publish their views on strategy. That required a lot of push. Like I personally talked with a number of the people at these organizations and questioned them about why they did not publish anything like that. And eventually they did in fact publish this. And I think these organizations, I think there is a very wide discrepancy between the organizations in how they would react to these kind of Infohazards. I think DeepMind and OpenAI I don't trust at all. I think these organizations, if they learned about secrets that from Conjecture on how to train AI faster, they would just, build it as fast as possible. Org and Anthropic, I think, are both questionable. All are not actually training AIs. Anthropic, I would be very hesitant with sharing information with those. The Alignment Research Center and of course Conjecture seem like organizations that have their shit together, even if I don't know enough about the organizations to really trust them. And MIRI is the only organization I would be confident in actually informing them about this kind of Infohazard. What are the considerations for this policy? One of them is that we need to be able to coordinate. That's required to share information and ensure we're not working at the same thing, and we are prioritizing towards the right areas. Some kind of exchange of information that is potentially infohazardous is required. And I think the reason why this is required in particular is because we are very much in a race against the capability labs, and that means that that we cannot accept. I don't think Conjecture should accept a too limiting Infohazard policy, because that will just mean they will be too inefficient. Another consideration is it's hard to tell in advance how dangerous an Infohazard is, and that's of course a problem both for Conjecture and for the people around them, and potentially adversaries. That's an ameliorating factor in my view. There's a consideration that secrets are hard to keep, in particular if you have to keep them for a long time and if you have many secrets. I don't actually think that these two considerations are very strong. Sure, it matters to keep, it's harder to keep a secret for a long time, but the number of people who know the secret is way more important. And what are these kind of people? Are they different people? Are they the perfect thing you want to do is something like the CIA that uses Mormons very much, who are this stereotypically completely non-diverse, and that makes them much more capable of keeping secrets. They're talking about a trade-off between safety and security. At least it may be a trade-off, because the obvious siloing of information is in fact not really a part of a trade-off. There isn't, as far as I can see, an obvious trade-off between safety and security. At least there may be something that I haven't thought about, but and finally, functional decision theory is described as an important consideration. Functional decision theory is that you should treat your decision as the output of a fixed mathematical function that answers the question, which output of this very function would yield the best outcome. In order to analyze this, there are two things that could be the output: either a policy or a decision to leak or not to leak. And like precisely how you would go about analyzing this depends on precisely what they want to how this analysis goes. So I didn't. This may be something we can ask Chris. And finally, of all these considerations, I think they're all important. But I think there's one one consideration that really trumps all the other, and that is like we need to get some kind of measure of what things are infohazardous and how infohazardous are they. That seems to me as like the key consideration. Okay, what is covered and what is not covered. In particular, the thing that is not covered by that is not one of these infohazards are PR hazards and reputational hazards. I think that's a really good clarification because a lot of companies would certainly keep this kind of thing confidential. They try to strive for meta honesty, and that means to be honest about how honest you are. And I had some questions about that, but Elias Yudkowsky warns that it's dangerous to ask questions about meta honesty because you can very easily get to probe like object level information. Like if I ask them about like if Miri came to you with a pivotal act, what would they do about that? How would they react to this? Then it's very easy to use this kind of information to probe for what are they actually talking. Do they have this kind of secrets? So I'm unsure about the best way to go about this. I'm also unsure about the best way to go about meta honesty in general. And a part of this is because the incentives are very strong. Like obviously the incentives inside the organization are extremely strong. Like Connor, for instance, I expect he can probably fire people at will. In Elias Yudkowsky's talk about this, he talk about people who have like a gun, and of course that's the extreme example. But in fact, if Connor wants to fire someone, then he probably just can. So meta honesty is very hard in this kind of not only truth-seeking environment. And of course, there are other people. The government probably can go to an employee in Conjecture and say, hey, tell us this, or you will go to jail and you'll get some kind of gag order against it. And that seems like another problem. In general, I think meta honesty is hard enough that if you want to have like a policy on this, you should reference some existing work on what is meta honesty actually. And then finally, on what is covered, they define using a limit. Like the least infohazardous thing that is still covered by this is letting it be known outside of Conjecture that they are interested in using, building, or deploying a technique that already exists in the literature in order to train networks faster. And I think this kind of formulation with like this limit is really great. I'm not sure I really care very much about training networks faster. I think that's like the framing that Conjecture is using and that a lot of people are using, and I think like smarter, more intelligent is really better in some way. In practice, the thing that I actually care about is whether there's a way to train a network to be more capable among Bostrom's 6 strategic cognitive tasks. That's like my idiosyncratic view on AI safety, that this is in fact the thing that we should care about. So the rules that Conjecture set up have 3 levels of disclosure: secret, private, and public, with secret being the default, and they will think about this after trialing for some months. Ben Pace in the comments replied that there's a process for changing information between these levels, and that seems really like it's a lot of work to change something from private to secret. This information is there are 3 levels and 3 types of information: repositories, projects, and ideas. And the projects have access documents with some information about like the secret. It looks like repositories don't have access documents, and I think they should have that. I also think that some of the rules, if they're written like meant to be understood by a lawyer or something like that, like these kind of rules end up becoming like legal rules in some way. And then there are some formulations that need to be tied up, like knowing about a secret or knowing a secret are perhaps 2 different things. In this rule set, Connor Lee has a very special role. He's the appointed Infohazard coordinator. He has access to everything, and it's unclear precisely how he's supposed to interact with it. Like he could, like Donald Trump, who claimed he had declassified secret documents in his head. And it's not entirely clear from this whether Connor actually has the right to just declassify things in his head. And if he does have that, then of course the rules binding him are much less strict. Ben Pace also in the comments add that this is a potentially very problematic position for Connor, because a CEO may not be available at all times for employees to talk with, and I think this is putting a substantial amount of responsibility on the CEO, who have more important things to do. How do they deal with policy violations? Well, people in Conjecture sign NDAs. I think getting these NDAs actually enforced seem really, really difficult. Like if we get something, if Connor or Conjecture believes that something is important enough that it is info-hazardous, that probably means that it is something that is strategically valuable, and for that reason, NDAs by definition don't cover things that are in the public interest, and whether something that is in the national interest is also in the public interest is an interesting question. It is not clear that these NDAs will hold up, but I'm no lawyer. And of course, if they did try to enforce them, then the Streisand effect would certainly kick in. And for the policy violations, basically Connor has the final say. He stakes his reputation on his judgments. Mistakes in the beginning are of course acceptable. And as he says, nobody will be fired for raising a concern in good faith. I thought that was a kind of a strange formulation. Like obviously the thing that I would expect him to write is that no one would be fired for admitting a not very serious mistake in disclosure during the first couple of months. But that's actually not what he's technically writing. And this also, this policy is also in charge, in effect for the leadership of Conjecture, and it's Gabriel who will initiate a process against Connor. And there is a final remark that the policy needs to be practical, and people who are doing experiments in Conjecture, which they're basically doing all the time, they need to look at each specific case and say, okay, this is actually not really dangerous at all, and then no review is necessary. And I think this kind of practicality is probably required. Conjecture has a quarterly policy review. I won't go through it here, but I'd be really interested in whether this is a thing that happens and whether it's something that actually finds issues, because I would put at least a non-zero percentage probability that this is the kind of thing that people just forget because everybody's too busy. Finally, there's a chapter about psychological safety that I think is important, because secrets do take some kind of emotional toll, and they're upfront about this, and people get stressed and isolated if they're having to do with secrets, and this kind of stress and isolation make people more likely to then give up on the secrecy. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to not have people only working on secret projects. So if their wife asks them, what are you working on, then they can actually say something instead of zero. Having emotional support people seems interesting, and like what's the social structure of secrets in Conjecture. I think that's all of it is good, and I'm happy that they are writing about this. I think one of my final comments on like the big picture of this Infohazard policy is by comparing to government and military security clearance systems. And the way these work is that they very, very heavily rely on background checks. That's a very big thing in order to get access to classified documents. And there are a number of dimensions you can be disqualified on and prevented from getting a security clearance. Mental health issues are problems, financial issues, like if you have unpaid bills or something like that, then you can't get a clearance. If you've ever used drugs or you have any foreign contacts and all these kind of things, and I expect that there is a lot of problems. Like I expect that basically no one in Conjecture would be able to get a clearance, and many of them would fail for many different reasons. And I think that's not just a thing in Conjecture. I think it's in the alignment community in general. And I think we are a really bad community for dealing with this kind of sensitive information. But that doesn't absolve us of the obligation to actually try. That's all I had for today. I think now, instead of ending the recording, because Chris Gamel is joining us soon, I would like to ask people in the reading group for questions. What should we ask Chris Gamel when he joins us in a moment? I've written a couple of things down, but I'd also like to take your thoughts. Does anyone have a question for Chris?
Yeah, I think I brought this up in our last meeting. It's just that, in my opinion, most people who are interested in AI safety aren't employed in the field. I mean, I'm interested in it and I'm not getting paid for it. So, like, how would someone like me find out about like in my mind, there's this pretty big area of information where you might not want to share with the general public, but everyone who's working on alignment really should know about. Um, and I was wondering how you disseminate that information like that, because I think it's really important that we're all on the same page and don't have duplicated efforts in terms of alignment research.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'll write it down. And I think we will ask Chris about how to deal with this kind of info hazard, like because it is quite unclear. People who are like independent alignment researchers, how they actually fit into this. Like one way would be to have like a community info hazard coordinator or something like that, who someone whose job is like, if someone in alignment have an idea that could be potentially info hazardous, then they tell that info hazard coordinator, who's like not employed at Conjecture but also like like community wide, whether that is a position that could make sense.
I'm not clear, just from this paper and from the couple of minutes I spent looking at the Conjecture's website, just what their product is. Is that a sensible question to put it like that?
Yeah, I think the product is two things: alignment research and some miscellaneous AI things that they stumble upon. Like while they are working with these, then they had some kind of better way of creating. I mean, I think it was like text to speech or something like that. And then they commercialized a model that was doing text to speech or something like that. So I don't think there is any obvious
I remember hearing some of Connor's interviews from a couple weeks ago, and he mentioned that they were trying to build some kind of AI system that used large language models as a component, but not as the end product. So I think there's still, one of their end goals is still like just AGI in general, but it's supposed to be safer than large language models or, you know, other systems like that.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a reasonable way to incorporate. Okay, so I think Chris is joining us. Can you just excuse me for just a moment? I'm back, and Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Hello, great to have you. We are currently recording. Thank you for joining us for these questions. So we do have a couple of questions. The first question that I would like to pose is the Conjecture's Infohazard policy requires or talks about a quarterly review. You can see here, and my obvious question is: have you done these reviews, and have you learned anything in these that you can share? Like, how well is the Infohazard policy actually? Does it work for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question and just for this opportunity to talk about the Infohazard policy in general. So we have done these reviews, and the big thing for us has been kind of implementing the security protocols on top of the kind of more informal verbal policies. So when we first put this into place, we didn't have a security team. And the best we could do on kind of data separation was in Google Workspace, like different shared drives and setting permissions levels, and different Slack channels and setting permission levels, and different GitHub repos and setting permission levels there. And we've now done a lot more to kind of segment access to model weights across different parts of Conjecture, to split out kind of product team from engineering team and who can see what. And yeah, built a lot more of the kind of technical back end of the policy. Another thing that we've kind of talked about quarterly is just, is it working? There are projects that I do not know about at Conjecture, and that has been a pretty strong litmus test for us throughout. That said, there have been opportunities where people have shared things internally that have kind of gone past the secret categorization, and we've noticed slip-ups there. And then there's also been times that things have been private, which is categorized specifically within Conjecture, where someone has spoken to someone who's kind of not in the private group about it. And part of what was not super well addressed in the Infohazard policy was how to deal with those edge cases, or sorry, not edge cases, just like slip-ups. I think the original document said things like it would be reviewed and it's a fireable offense if you do this kind of thing. We have not fired anyone from this. It's tended to be that these accidents happen in really innocuous ways rather than people kind of explicitly spilling secrets. And I think, yeah, the policy was just a little prohibitive and strict as we first wrote it. So we've gotten kind of lax on that. Other things that we've changed about it, we haven't changed this one yet, but we're currently discussing whether a fourth level is needed. There's some differentiation between the secret category and the private category that continues to feel a little restrictive for how we want to set up team access. There are there's some divisions within that about how we want things to be shared, such that it might make sense to have like secret, private, semi-private, and public. So we're talking about a fourth level. But overall, it's worked pretty well. I think Conjecture has been tight-lipped about most of the things that we're doing that are capabilities advancing, and that's the point. The Infohazard policy is to protect your ability to work on capabilities without letting those secrets spill.
Great. Laumain, you had a question?
Yeah. So my question was that given how important it is for the alignment community in general to not have duplicated effort, given the low number of people working on alignment in general, and also given that a lot of people working on alignment aren't affiliated with known groups, a lot of people are doing it independently or part-time. How do you plan on like disseminating information to independent researchers who aren't affiliated with a known group?
It's a good question.
And how important is it in your for us to do that, in your opinion?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. And I know there's been some debate about this on Less Wrong recently, particularly around interpretability research. So we err on the side of caution and think that it's very possible for Conjecture to be net negative if capabilities that we're working on leak. And so we definitely err on the side of sharing a lot less at the expense of not having a super collaborative discussion about the projects that we're working on. We've had slightly different stances on this in the past. Like there was one point where we were trying to do research sprints where we were publishing shorter, less comprehensive looks into what we were investigating. These were all things that we felt were not kind of capabilities pushing, but at this point we're pretty much publishing none of our research, not because everything we're working on is info-hazardous, but just because the trade-off right now between doing things internally and publishing externally has us, undervaluing the sharing in communities. What I said about Conjecture being net negative is roughly, we don't think any of the things that we've done on an alignment front have significantly moved the needle in such a way that if we weren't to do one tiny thing that sped up timelines right now, we'd be net positive. So we think it's very easy for us still at this stage to move into the negative side and want to kind of continue to be cautious and protective there. There's a bigger question here, which is that Conjecture's research has now consolidated around one particular agenda, cognitive emulation, and we've written very little on this publicly. I think it's probably in our interest to start writing more because the vision is getting a little bit more crystallized, and it's likely worth it to kind of put that out in a public way that people start poking at.
So if I can expand a bit on Laumain's question, let's say that an independent AI researcher, let's say Laumain concretely comes up with some insight related to this agenda, cognitive emulation, and then he says this could be info-hazardous. Who should he reach out to? Is there someone in Conjecture that he should reach out to?
Oh, I see. I misunderstood that part of the question. Thanks for clarifying. So this actually has come up in the past. I've been at an EAG where someone shared with me, hey, I think I have something info-hazardous. Is it potentially worth someone at Conjecture's time to talk about this? I think it really depends. We don't have a ton of bandwidth internally to have conversations with everyone who has a research idea, and we get a lot of people sending messages to hello@Conjecture, which is kind of our generic inbox, suggesting things that they think might be useful for us. It's probably better to try to get the ear of someone who's kind of trusted or respected in the alignment community who's close to you and kind of get that view first, and then if it seems like more relevant to the stuff that Conjecture is working on, then bring it over to discuss with us. If someone kind of needs a generic opinion about is this thing info-hazardous or not, it seems to me that it's better for them to put their effort or to put their time into someone that they just generally trust really well. Ideally someone who's seen as kind of an AI safety expert, than to reach out to someone particular at Conjecture. Within Conjecture, though, the way that info-hazards are shared is as described in the document. Connor's the only person that kind of knows all info-hazards. Sid has a view over some of the technical kind of implementations of info-hazards, and then team leads are all aware of kind of what's on the project. So the idea is kind of share it with the person closest to you and boil it up. If anyone knows people at Conjecture, it's probably a pretty good crew of people to bounce ideas off of, but it is hard for us just to answer to any independent researcher on that.
Great. Thank you. Chris, you had a question. I don't know. I tried to answer it before. Do you want to go with your questions? Or
yes. Well, I just want to know if you could characterize sort of your Conjecture's product, as it were, essentially what you are putting. I gather, some of it is in the lines of pure research, some of it's trying to be commercialized. Can you just expand on that?
Yeah. So in terms of like valuable IP internally, it's definitely the language models that we're training. And we have a strong team of engineers who kind of came from Eleuther AI and built some of the, at the time, largest open source models, and we've continued those training runs internally. And so from an IP perspective, it's, internal language models, and then anything that you can do with them is kind of the direction of what we're thinking about for product. There's two paths that Conjecture is currently looking at. One is kind of B2B enterprise solutions that fall out of our research agenda or like along the same build path there. An example of this might be something like we need strong, quick fine-tuning internally, where maybe we only have a limited data set and we need to kind of expand that into a data set of the size that you can use for fine-tuning. We want this pipeline internally as a tool that is useful to build towards cognitive emulation. It's also something that we can productize and sell to enterprise partners who maybe have limited data sets but also want proprietary models to kind of work within their system, maintain privacy boundaries between their data and an external provider, and yeah, fit some sort of custom niche use case. So that's one of the B2B directions that we're thinking about. On the B2C front, the first thing that we tried was a product called Verbalize, which was a speech-to-text model. It was pretty good as like an API, and it's now served as an API, but we tried to make it into a SaaS product, and it just wasn't that great. It was a little buggy. We were too slow with it. There are a whole bunch of other competitors that came into the space, and so we've mostly scrapped that. One of the things that we're toying with right now, because eventually we would like kind of general multimodal capabilities within Conjecture, is we're training a text-to-speech model, and the idea is then to kind of build a pipeline from speech to text to language models to text to speech, such that you can kind of speak directly to an LLM and have it speak back to you. This could start out as like a toy gimmicky thing, but eventually it could be a way of interfacing with language models that's more interesting to users.
Right. Is it possible to speak in terms of whether you sort of break even currently at the moment, or are you depending on
we're hugely
somebody's
loss
funding?
making. Yeah, hugely loss making.
Okay.
We have very little revenue, still very much in the R&D stage. Part of the reason to invest in a generative AI company that is sinking, millions of dollars into training runs, but not making anything of a profit, is either because you believe there is going to be some near-term commercial success from these things, or because you're investing from the perspective of like AI in the future will have a lot more control and accessibility and kind of be built into larger parts of the economy. We're hedging between both of these strategies. We think within the next 3 to 12 months, we'll easily be able to take some of the larger models we have, productize them, do some of these enterprise solutions on top of them that would actually be really meaningful for businesses. But there's also kind of a longer term bet, which is the research agenda that Conjecture is pursuing, this cognitive emulation work, is about building safe and powerful systems. And so the idea is if you can figure that out well, and these systems are steerable and controllable, that unlocks a ton of value. So riskier, much less likely to work, much longer term, but really kind of where our main efforts are focused. It might be worth it just to say a short bit on cognitive emulation for those who don't have much context. Conjecture's mainline, as one of the more pessimistic orgs out there on the AI safety problem, is that it is absurd, given the level of today's AI safety, to build superintelligence. And we consider this kind of the mainline path of a lot of the kind of major AI orgs out there. It's not to stop at human level intelligence. It's really to truly build things that are transformative. An example is like Anthropic's leak pitch deck said something like, building models orders of magnitude larger than OpenAI that we expect can automate significant parts of the economy by 2025 or 2026 and create such a moat that no one will be able to catch up. That is not the business that Conjecture is in. We're not just building larger and larger models and hoping to deploy them for huge economic gain. We are instead trying to build an AI architecture where language models slot into cognitive kind of steps that the overall architecture is taking, such that when you inspect what it does, any time that you're actually using a black box, it's used in a very limited way where you can say, okay, I don't understand this step, but I understand kind of the overall explainable reasoning process that the system is pursuing in general. So I might not know what's going on in the black box, but I do know what the system overall is doing. And so it's kind of a mix of traditional software, some things like LangChain, AutoGPT, and some more kind of like factored cognition stuff that is the research direction that we're pursuing in-house. And the language models are part of this system rather than being kind of the primary engine that controls the majority of cognition.
That's great. Thank you.
I have another question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I have another question, unless someone else wants to go first. Right. So, right now I'm feeling a lot of FOMO because, like, I kind of missed out on the whole crypto train a decade ago. And yeah, I mean, kind of caught it, but not as much as I wanted to. So right now I'm feeling the same in terms of AI. Like I really want to put all of my money into like Microsoft and Google, but I also don't want to die. So is there a way for me to for the average person to invest in groups like Conjecture that have a strong AI safety focus?
Um, I'll start by saying I'm the wrong person to give investment advice, and I feel like this question is maybe best dealt with not from a money perspective and more just from a like, how does one get involved in support on AI safety? And maybe one of the ways that people want to do that is financially, but another way could be, volunteering time, and another could be, going through the upskilling process to try to become technical and proficient in some of the more specific domains like interpretability. I thought about this a lot, the question of, what can anyone do to participate? Because I think there's a kind of, unfortunately, very small amount of shovel-ready work in AI safety. A lot of the barrier to participation is quite technical. So I would say kind of two main things. One is educate yourself. There's tons of reading that can be done online, and the conversation's moving very quickly, and simply knowing a lot is, I think, a big benefit to how people can find opportunities when they come up. Maybe there's a job that opens up that's meaningful to you, and now you know enough to participate in it. Maybe there's something that is a totally unrelated job. You're working in finance or something like that, and an AI conversation comes up where you can inform people about safety risks versus not. I think a lot of the change that will happen around AI safety is from everyday people realizing that this will be super, risky, and making that clear. I think we're starting to see way more headlines changing around AI safety, and I think you kind of need the public opinion to change for expert policymakers to change their mind too. So more involvement in the conversation is good. The second thing I would say is like mental health above finances. I am long chaos. Like I have no idea what's coming, but I think it's going to be very strange one way or another. Either the future is going to be really great, but transform very quickly, or it could be really bad. But I think volatility would be high one way or another. Investing in this direction seems risky and speculative to me on pretty much every direction. I think you can both say AI is an extreme bubble right now that could burst, or it's, the thing that will transform the future. Who knows? It could die in the same way crypto dies. There's also people who are like, I'm going to put everything in NVIDIA right now. Also seems like a really risky thing. So I would give more advice on get educated, invest in well-being and kind of long-term personal stability, and probably stick with a normal investing portfolio and diversified stuff. But don't listen to me on investment advice financially. Thanks for the question.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? I think in particular, you said you would be answering questions for like 20 minutes, half an hour, and I think we are way past that point. So if you have to leave, then that is perfectly fine.
Not in a rush. It's 8:49 here now, so maybe 10 more minutes. Happy to take anything else that people are curious about.
Other than I have a question about other info hazards. Because we're only talking about what Elias Yudkowsky calls exfo hazards,
right.
And there may be other more very prosaically, someone may come up with like a really good way to prompt a language model to make really good bioweapons, or someone may more exotically come up with like a new like Rocco's basilisk but actually working, and in that case, obviously telling Connor about this new version of Rocco's basilisk that actually works is like really the wrong move, right?
Yeah, probably above any of the rules in the Infohazard policy is use good judgment. So, something like the basilisk would be an example of if it's obviously and precisely the wrong move, don't do it. I think the spirit of the law is extremely important with Infohazards, given that there's so many edge cases and things that are kind of hard to put one's finger on. With something like bioweapons, which may be kind of orthogonal rather than kind of advancing AI capabilities themselves. It's related to another hazard. We would definitely consider that infohazardous. I think we generally put that term around anything that we think could cause danger and harm to the world or speed up capabilities in some kind of way. So yeah, biorisks would definitely fall into that category.
Okay. Yeah. I did have a question here about functional decision theory. With one of the considerations in designing the Infohazard policy is written as just basically the word functional decision theory, and like, don't screw it up for everyone. Could you walk us through the functional decision theory, the functional decision theory considerations in designing the policy?
Yeah, I can try. This is not really my area of expertise. I mostly understand functional decision theory as if I'm going to act from a policy and I can assume that everyone else is acting from the same policy, how would that kind of change my decisions here? And so as it relates to infohazards, I think a lot of the time there's a kind of potentially an itch to be the exception. Like, this is a situation in which I feel it's safe to tell the person because I trust them a lot, and this is the exception to the rule here. The functional decision theory is just like, no, because if you act by that policy, then you assume that everyone who thinks that they end up in kind of an edge case scenario will speak as well, and so it tends to lean towards maximum conservative behavior, abiding by the rules of the policy, and ideally, ensuring a game theoretic happy solution of as few secrets being shared as possible and ending up in a world that is the safest because of that. So that's my rough hand waving around the subject. I imagine there's much more technical ways to get into this and describe it.
Okay, great. I think all my questions have been answered. So I am wondering, does anyone else have other questions? Let me just
I would have one question for the group, which is just curiosity what they think of the policy, any critiques, any suggestions, any kind of discussion points that came up in your talk that were meaningful.
One of them that I can point out here is the rules document seems like it's not a legal document, but it's almost it's something that if there is some person who violates this, then it will be litigated as if it was a legal document. And there are a number of formulations, for instance, about mistakes. Connor the document says that nobody will be fired for raising a concern in good faith, and I think what he's actually meaning is admitting no one will be fired for admitting a non-serious mistake in disclosure. That's at least how I read the document, but it's very much not written as a legal document. Has a lawyer actually read this document?
We have an NDA built into all of our contracts that goes through a very kind of typical information protection scheme. We threw the word Infohazard in there as a kind of bid to the Infohazard policy that we wrote, but the policy itself is not written as a legally enforceable thing. It's written as kind of a socially enforceable thing. I think the idea even for private Infohazards, ones that are maybe shared between two different orgs, is if you share this, we tell everyone you shared it, and your reputation is hurt as a participating org in this ecosystem.
Okay, so that was one of my comments. Let me just see if I've had some other things.
Can I just ask you? Sorry, I noticed on Less Wrong and also on Alignment Forum, where the that document is posted in those two places, and there are not many comments on them in the year since it's been there. So how do you feel about the response in general? Are you disappointed that people are not taking interest, or?
I think it's important for AI safety labs to have Infohazard policies, and my sense is that people are a lot more liberal in their communications at other firms. I think this is bad. I'm not that surprised that there's not been a lot of comments. I think Conjecture is a pretty small org, pretty new, doesn't have, the most sterling reputation, and so for us to like do something and expect that a whole bunch of people follow would be naive at this stage. I would love for a future where Conjecture is in a position to set the precedent on what good security and safety policies look like, and I think at that point we can, re-raise the Infohazard policy as this is, a standard that we think other labs should be able to meet. We definitely had more private engagement. When we wrote it, a lot of people commented on it. To my understanding, there was one other small lab that ended up introducing something quite similar. With larger labs, I think it's very hard to set precedent there, but I do know that it was at least discussed within some of these larger labs, just from kind of personal anecdotes of people sharing that. So yeah, small splash, but kind of within anticipated bounds.
So the thing that I think it would obviously be compared to would be like normal business confidentiality, like Anthropic doesn't have an Infohazard policy, but I am sure when you join Anthropic, you also sign NDAs that say probably very close to the same thing. And like my question is how big, like there's two things that need to be compared, like when you consider whether to have an explicit Infohazard policy or just say we have standard business confidentiality. Like it draws attention to the fact that you may have important secrets, but it allows you to make a much more finely tuned do you agree with this trade-off, and did you consider just doing normal business confidentiality to not draw attention to the fact that you may have secrets?
I don't think we considered that. Writing the Infohazard policy was important to the founders from the start. If you're in the business of training large language models and building powerful AI systems, I don't think you're within normal bounds of normal business confidentiality and assuming that you might have nothing to hide. The number of security attacks on AI companies is increasing, and I heard a stat from an expert that was something like, I'm recounting what I heard, I did not check this number, it seemed really high to me, but it was something like 1 in 3 attacks on AI companies are like targeted attacks are trying to get at model weights. That seemed absurdly high to me, but I think the general impression was people are aware of the value of these weights, and yeah, like number of kind of cyber attacks are increasing. So from a like technical security perspective, extremely important, and people know that the kind of treasure is there. And then from a verbal safety perspective, I think one of the big things that the Infohazard policy has done, besides making kind of explicit boundaries internally with silos, is bake in this kind of conversation to Conjecture and give people a vocabulary in which to talk about it in a really straightforward way. And I think that's been beneficial.
Okay. I don't actually have more questions. Yeah, there's one by Ben Pace. He posted on Less Wrong and argued that there's a risk with this kind of policy that like it requires that Connor has a lot of time, right? And that he's responsive. If you have something that perhaps needs to be a new secret, then the requirement to discuss it with Connor, if you want to check whether this is an overlap with another existing secret or something like that. That like how do you have any sense of how well that works? Is this actually a problem in practice?
Right now we're small enough that it's not a problem. I could imagine in the future, maybe. I think we'd have to be pretty big for this not to be a thing. I think the idea that you can discuss with your lead is discussing with the lead is kind of the first step for things that are in the maybe category. It's formally starting another work stream that requires Connor's approval. And in that sense, Connor's very involved in setting the research direction for the company, and so I don't think that would be any concern about time sensitivity. I think the larger concern I've heard raised around the Infohazard policy is just that it puts a lot of control in Connor's hands to have total visibility and to run the company. And it's like, yep, that's because we trust Connor internally and think he's doing a great job. And so I think a lot of this is very intentional power concentration in someone who is a trusted figure. And for a lot of reasons, while we're small especially, it makes sense for kind of one person to have full steering direction and control. As we get bigger, maybe more checks and balances make sense. But at this point, it doesn't really feel like a huge cost to be paying.
Okay.
So how many people work at Conjecture?
Right now it's like 22.
Yeah. And I'm still not really understanding what the Conjecture plan is. I mean, it makes sense in a vacuum, but how does it function in a world where OpenAI and Anthropic are very clear that they're scaling up very quickly?
Yeah, so in my mind, it's like it would be awesome to live in a world where one of Anthropic, OpenAI, or DeepMind was like, hey, we're not going to build superintelligence. This is us kind of laying down the swords and pushing for governance that sets a hard cap on training runs, that talks about extreme compute governance and needing to regulate this powerful technology, that says this is the limit of power that we think is appropriate to build to given the state of alignment research is so far behind. None of the major players seem to be doing that. Their governance policies are largely carving out space for them to be the ones who are going to continue to build superintelligence. Their technical plans are train larger and larger models and build superintelligence, and their safety plans are predicated on superintelligence. Like scalable oversight is a plan where you have one superintelligence overseeing another superintelligence because the capabilities of these systems surpass the human level. Conjecture is an alternative to that. So the idea is no superintelligence, cap systems at an explainability that makes sense to humans and build them from the bottom up such that they can be understood by humans. Push for policy regulations that prevent people from building superintelligence and mandate the need to kind of push alignment further before you build more capabilities. And so in a lot of ways, Conjecture is quite deontological in this sense. It's like, maybe we won't win, but someone out there should be doing it. And our plan is to try to do it well, to scale up, to be a larger voice, to be able to hire more people and work on this agenda, and to push forward with an ambitious plan despite the odds.
So, if Laumain wanted to be hired by Conjecture, I have no clue if you actually want that, but let's say, what kind of research paper should he be writing and sending to you, like on cognitive emulation? Is there like a subfield of that would be interesting to you, or?
Yeah, I would push people more towards hacky, engineering, tinkering right now than research directions. Stuff that's kind of in line with what we're building are like, hey, if you've like tried to train GPT-3 internally, like just by yourself, if you've looked up papers on model training, if you're familiar with distributed training, if you've like just gone and hacked open source, those are the type of people we want. We want people who have strong technical skills that are willing to kind of bootstrap a project from the bottom up by themselves, and are really kind of curious about where AI is going. Cognitive emulation is a builder's research agenda more than an academic's research agenda at this point. There are some hard technical questions like how do you factor cognition in a way that scales? You know, this is a problem that a lot of people have run into and one that we are going to run into on this path as well. But right now we're still in the there's just a ton of things that we need to build and strap together to get systems where we're even running into these kind of questions as the limiting factors. So yeah, people who have familiarity playing with language models, who have worked on LangChain, who have worked on AutoGPT, who are generally aware of kind of state-of-the-art research in advances like different training regimes and things like that. Those are all interesting things for us. From a research perspective, I would say that we are doing a lot less interpretability than we used to be doing. We've moved more towards explainability than interpretability, meaning we are not super optimistic about being able to kind of penetrate the black box, and instead we want to limit the uses of black box in a system that is kind of overall understandable for how its logic flows. So yeah. more of
Uh,
that.
I have another question. So none of the large language models thus far that aren't open source, I, let me rephrase that. All of the cutting edge large language models are currently not available in either mainland China or um, Hong Kong, Macau, places like that. Is that due to US law or due to Chinese law or just an internal thing?
Um, I think there's a lot of complicated factors right now. I think there's also kind of a big global conversation around competition with language models and where the tech is being built and who has access to it. And um, yeah, this is a complicated subject. I think one of the important points that is quite dangerous right now is like overemphasizing this race or this competition. You know, one of the justifications for building powerful language models in the West is, oh, well, what if China gets there first? You know, what if one of our competitors builds the transformative AI system before us? Um, I think thinking like this is a rationalization for the building of superintelligence that's already been on the agenda for kind of the major research labs in the West. And at this point, it's now a like sexy policy narrative that can convince government officials that we should also continue to build powerful AI. I think this is quite foolish. I think there's many reasons to believe that the race is not quite as tight as people make it out to be. I think there's also many other ways that we can go about approaching this race by, you know, limiting export controls and things like that. And generally overemphasizing the we need to win narrative seems super dangerous to me. So that's kind of what I'll say on the China US, China West kind of LLM stuff.
What I'm really trying to ask is, how is there a way for someone who's interested in AI safety to like get access to some of the invite only models, like what is it, Cloud,
Yeah,
the one
Claude
from
is
our friend?
Anthropic's model.
Yeah.
I think for people who are working on research, it's possible to get kind of individual permissions. I don't know how this works from a regional perspective, but yeah, I would try reaching out to some research groups that have access and trying to see if there's projects that are meaningful to work on with them. There's a number of alignment upskilling programs, for example, that are accessible. You know, people start with something like AGI Safety Fundamentals, and then they consider moving on to something like MLab for more technical upskilling, SARI Mats, where you get paired with a mentor who's working in alignment. These programs have access to models, and so it might be a little bit more difficult as an independent researcher, but any type of training program that connects you into this space would also give you access.
All right, thanks.
Okay, does anyone have any final questions for Chris? Then I would like to once again say thank you very much, Chris, for joining us, and I've really enjoyed your answers, and good luck at Conjecture.
Yeah, thanks, Soren, and thanks for
Oh,
discussing the subject and inviting me.
right. But before you leave, I would just like to say that from the Chinese perspective, the AI race is very, very real. I mean, we're trying really, really hard to not get left behind in the AI race. So it's not like it. I think that the dismissing the China U.S. AI race is very much a mistake.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for pointing out that nuance. I think the point I want to emphasize is something like one reason to talk about the race is to talk about the fact that there are dangerous capabilities that are kind of expanding all over the globe, and we need to be careful about building and concerned about how these technologies can be misused or if they get deployed and there's misalignment risks. That's good. I think pointing out the risks serious, pointing out that there are competitive actors is important. The thing that I'm concerned about is that one of the ways that the race narrative gets spun is as a justification to continue building even more dangerous technologies. And I think if you don't believe that the race is neck and neck, then it's easier to think about something like a 6-month pause on AI capabilities in the West as a useful and not competitively lethal strategy for us to take to try to end up in a safer world. Yeah, a lot of this gets into kind of technical details about access to compute and who's building what and technical competency and if secrets are, developed internally or, learned from others. And yeah, I guess without going down that rabbit hole, I think it's important to kind of consider both the reality and then how the narrative gets used socially to justify different things after that.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again. Be well, have a good night, and nice to meet you.
You too, and good luck.
Thanks a lot. Great.
Okay. So that was great. I'm gonna stop the recording now. And